There is something you have known about yourself for a very long time that you have never quite been able to say out loud, not because you do not understand it, but because saying it feels like admitting to something embarrassing. You have always felt like everyone is watching you, not in the way a person with ordinary self-consciousness feels briefly exposed in a new room, something deeper than that. A constant low-level awareness that you are visible, that eyes find you even when you have done nothing to invite them, that your presence registers in a space before you have chosen to make it register, and that this quality of being noticed without trying was something you were taught very early to feel ashamed of. Perhaps the adults around you called you too sensitive, too self-aware, too dramatic. Perhaps they told you the world did not revolve around you, and you understood that to mean your instinct that the world was always looking at you was a sign of something wrong, rather than a sign of something true. Perhaps you learned to walk smaller, to enter rooms quietly, to do everything in your power to make the fact of your presence feel less like a fact. But here is what no one told you. The feeling that everyone is watching is not always anxiety pretending to be perception. Sometimes it is perception. Sometimes a person feels watched because they have a quality of presence so natural and so strong that it genuinely registers in rooms before they have spoken a word. And the shame of that, the specific shame of a child who learned that being noticed was dangerous, does not eliminate that quality. It only drives it underground, where it waits, where it becomes distorted, where it turns from a gift into a wound. Carl Jung believed that what we bury in shame does not dissolve, it descends, and what descends long enough in the dark does not simply grow weaker, it grows wilder, more frightening to us, harder to recognize as the original strength it once was. In this video, you will learn how to trace the thread of your oldest shame back to what it was before it became a shame. Not to relive the pain, but to find what the pain was protecting. Because sometimes the quality that made you feel most exposed as a child is the exact quality the world has been waiting for you to finally stop apologizing for. Number 1. The wound that was never a wound. There is a particular kind of child who fills a room without meaning to, who does not need to shout or perform or demand, who simply arrives and something in the air changes. Adults sense it before they can name it. Other children sense it before they understand it. And the child herself senses it most of all in the way attention gathers around her, in the way she can feel the mood of a room like a change in weather, in the way she is always aware that she is being seen. This is not vanity. It is not self-obsession. It is a form of perception, a highly developed sensitivity to social presence, to the invisible currents of attention that move between people in every shared space. It is, in many contexts, an extraordinary gift. But a gift that arrives before anyone has taught you how to hold it feels less like a gift and more like a condition. Because the adults around a child like this are often not prepared for what she carries. A parent who is uncomfortable with their own visibility will feel unsettled by a child who seems to attract eyes without effort. A teacher managing a room of 30 children cannot afford to acknowledge one child's unusual gravitational pull without disturbing the balance of everything else. A community that values blending in will experience a child who cannot help standing out as a subtle challenge to the rules that keep everyone safe. And so the corrections come, not always through cruelty, often through something quieter and harder to argue with, a look, a tone, a repeated instruction to stop making everything about yourself, a gentle but persistent pressure to take up less space, make less impact, become the kind of person who can be in a room without the room knowing it. I once knew a woman named Sarah. She had grown up in a large, loud family in a city where visibility felt genuinely risky, where standing out from your community was not encouraged, and where a child who seemed to absorb too much attention made the people around her uncomfortable in ways they could not fully explain. Sarah had that quality. Even as a small child, people noticed her. Teachers called on her even when her hand was not raised. Strangers spoke to her on the street. In photographs, she was always the one your eye moved to first, not because she was doing anything, but because of something in the way she held herself in the world. She spent her childhood being told, in 100 small ways, that this was a problem, that she was showing off, that she needed to learn humility, that she should think about how it made others feel to always have the spotlight. And Sarah, who was an intelligent and deeply feeling child, heard all of this and drew the only conclusion available to her, that there was something about her, some quality at the very center of how she existed in the world that was selfish and excessive and in constant need of restraint. By the time she reached adulthood, she had become masterful at making herself disappear. She dressed to avoid attention. She arrived late to events, so she could enter when the room was already occupied, and her arrival would register less. She spoke softly, even when she had something urgent to say. She had built an entire life organized around the project of not being noticed, and yet she felt, beneath all of it, a restlessness she could not explain, a sense that something in her was pressing against its container, a feeling, never quite spoken, that the life she was living was someone else's idea of what her life should look like. Carl Jung once wrote, "Everyone carries a shadow, and the less it is embodied in the individual's conscious life, the blacker and denser it is." Sarah's shadow was not made of darkness in the way we usually imagine. It was made of light that had been carefully covered over, a presence that had been disciplined into absence, a quality that had not disappeared, but had simply gone somewhere she could not yet look. This is what the shaming of a gift actually does. It does not remove the gift. The child who feels everything in a room does not stop feeling everything in a room because she was told her sensitivity was excessive. She simply stops trusting what she feels. The child who attracts attention without trying does not stop attracting attention because she was told her visibility was selfish. She simply learns to spend enormous amounts of energy fighting the thing that comes most naturally to her. And that spending, that constant exhausting labor of restraining what you naturally are, is exactly what the shadow costs you, not only in the energy lost to suppression, but in the specific abilities you needed that quality to develop the capacity to hold a room, to communicate with genuine presence, to be fully seen by the people who need to see you in order to trust you, in order to follow you, in order to let what you know actually land. Think of the quality you were most consistently corrected for as a child, not the behavior that was genuinely harmful, the quality beneath the behavior, the one that seemed to make the adults in your life uncomfortable before you had done anything wrong. Because somewhere in that quality is not evidence of what needed to be fixed. It is the first and most honest version of a strength the world still needs you to use. Number 2, how shame becomes a ceiling. The shame of childhood does not stay where we imagine it belongs. It does not remain in the rooms where it was first given to us. It travels. It moves forward into every new room we enter, operating so quietly beneath our awareness that we mistake it, after long enough, for our own considered opinion of ourselves. The person who is shamed for being too visible does not walk through adult life announcing that she is afraid of being seen. She calls herself an introvert. She calls herself someone who prefers to work behind the scenes. She develops a reputation for modesty and self-effacement that the people around her admire, never knowing that what they are admiring is not a virtue freely chosen, but a wound carefully maintained. She wants to share her work, but she softens it first. She removes the parts with the most life in them, because those are the parts most likely to make someone look. She wants to speak clearly about what she knows, but she frames it as a question, or as something she is still figuring out, so that it does not sound like she is claiming too much authority. She wants to stand in the center of what she is building, but she finds reasons to position herself at the edge. She has developed, over many years, a remarkable skill for making things that contain her presence and then removing the presence before anyone else can see it. And then she wonders why the things she makes do not quite land, why her voice does not carry the way she feels it should, why the people she is trying to reach somehow do not fully receive her. What she cannot yet see is that the same quality she has spent her life suppressing, that natural gravity, that involuntary visibility, is precisely the quality her work needs in order to reach people. Presence is not decorative. It is not something you add to communication the way you add punctuation. It is the thing that makes communication feel like it comes from a human being rather than a document. It is the difference between words that pass through a person and words that stay. There is a story about a young teacher named Marcus who had grown up being told he was too much, too loud, too certain, too magnetic in ways that his quieter family found exhausting. He had learned to become professionally calm, measured, carefully neutral in tone. By the time he was standing in front of classrooms full of students, he had mastered the art of delivering excellent information in a way that left almost no trace of himself behind. His students respected him. They did not love him. They learned from him the way you learn from a very good textbook accurately, efficiently, and without any particular feeling that a human encounter had taken place. And Marcus knew this. He could feel it in the rooms. The particular flatness of an interaction in which nothing surprising is at risk of happening. What he did not know was that the quality his family had called too much, that aliveness, that pull, that way of filling a space with something that made people pay attention, was exactly what his students needed from him. Not information delivered carefully from behind glass, but someone present enough to make the information feel like it mattered. The ceiling built from shame is invisible precisely because it presents itself as reasonable. It says, I am only being humble. I am only being appropriate. I am only being careful not to take up more space than I deserve. And these sound like virtues. They have the shape of virtues. But inside them, if you press gently enough, is an older and less generous voice. The voice that first told a child that the way she naturally existed in the world was a problem requiring constant management. Carl Jung once wrote, "One does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious." The darkness here is not cruelty or selfishness. The darkness is the belief, held so long it has become invisible, that your presence is a burden others must endure rather than a force others might actually need. When that belief is finally named, not argued with, not defeated, just named, seen clearly for what it is, the ceiling begins to crack. Not because the world suddenly becomes easier, but because you can finally see the difference between a limit you have chosen and a limit that was chosen for you before you were old enough to refuse it. Where in your life right now are you managing your presence instead of using it? Where are you making yourself smaller, not because the situation calls for it, but because smallness became a habit you formed in a room you no longer live in? Write it down if you can. Because what can be named can be examined, and what can be examined can eventually be chosen rather than simply obeyed. Number 3. The return of what was buried. There comes a moment, for many people, when what they buried very early begins pressing back toward the surface. It rarely arrives with a clear announcement. It comes instead as a dissatisfaction without an obvious cause. A life that looks entirely reasonable from the outside and feels, from the inside, like it was built for someone slightly different than you. A restlessness, a longing you cannot quite locate, a recurring sense that there is a version of you that has never been fully allowed into the room. Jung called this the individuation process, the slow movement of the psyche toward becoming more completely what it actually is. It is not comfortable. It does not feel, in the ordinary sense, like progress. It asks you to return not to the pain of the past, but to the original quality that was mislabeled by the past. To hold it again with adult hands and decide for yourself what it actually is. For the person whose visibility was shamed, this return looks like a very specific and very difficult thing. It looks like learning to stop treating your own presence as an imposition, because here is what happens when a person who is shamed for being too visible begins to step back toward what they buried. They do not simply recover a social ease or a professional confidence, they recover something much more fundamental. The ability to be fully in a room, to let what they know and feel and see actually reach the people in front of them, to stop standing just outside the frame of their own life as though they are not quite sure they have been invited in. Sarah, the woman I mentioned earlier, reached this moment in her late 30s. She had built by then a career that was quietly excellent and almost entirely invisible. She produced work that other people presented. She had ideas that other voices carried forward. She had become, with great skill and at great cost, someone who could fill a room with her quality of thinking while ensuring that no one quite knew it was her doing it. What brought her to the edge of something different was not a dramatic event. It was a very small one. She was in a meeting and she had an idea, and she began to speak about it in her usual way, gently, carefully, framed as a question, softened at every point, where it might otherwise have sounded too certain. And halfway through her own sentence, she stopped, not because she had lost the thought, because she heard herself. She heard the distance between what she actually knew and what she was allowing herself to sound like she knew, and something in her, very quietly, refused to keep going that way. She finished the sentence differently than she had started it, directly, without the softening. And the room changed, not dramatically, not in a way anyone else would have noticed, but she noticed. She felt, for the first time in a very long time, what it was like to be fully present in her own voice. Jung wrote that we do not so much find ourselves as recognize ourselves. The self was always there. What was missing was the willingness to look. The quality you were ashamed of as a child, the visibility, the presence, the way attention found you before you asked for it, was not a flaw your nature produced by mistake. It was your nature. It registered in rooms because it was real. It made people uncomfortable because real things sometimes do. And the shame that was attached to it was never actually part of it. It arrived with the shame the way weather arrives with a season. But they were never the same thing. You are in some form still that child, still the person whose presence registers before she speaks, still the person who feels the temperature of every room she enters, still the person who carries something in her that draws attention without trying. The difference is that now you are old enough to decide what that means, old enough to stop letting the discomfort of people who could not hold you determine how much of yourself you are allowed to bring. This is what it looks like to harness the shadow, not to become arrogant, not to become reckless, but to stop spending your energy managing the part of you that was always your greatest asset, to walk into the room and let your presence be what it is, to speak from the place where you actually know things, not from the careful edge of what you might be allowed to claim, to make things that contain you, all of you, and then leave them in the world without removing yourself from them first. You already know what it feels like to be seen. You have always known. The child who felt everyone watching was not wrong. She was only without the language to understand that being seen is not a vulnerability to be managed. It is, in the right hands, in your hands, a form of power. If this touched something you have been carrying for a long time, leave one line in the comments. Just the quality, the thing you were taught to be ashamed of. Not because you owe anyone an explanation, but because sometimes the first act of recovery is letting the buried thing be visible again. That is where it begins. Not in a grand performance of the self you have been suppressing, but in the quiet, serious, necessary decision to stop treating the most natural thing about you as the thing most in need of correction.